From the very first days of me making Macabre London, there's been one thing that people have always asked me for, and that's for bedtime stories. I've done a few of these before on Patreon, and there's still some over there now from the past if you want to check them out, but I figured it was now the time to start anew and to make some fresh ones, and I figured what better way to start than by reading my favourite ever book, The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Now, for those of you that have been with me for a long time, you all know that this book is my absolute favourite, and I do tend to read it once a year regardless. So I figured this time round, what better than to invite you along with me. Now, to introduce you to this, I thought it might be a good idea to just go back over exactly what Patreon is and how it works. But the idea is that I would like to give you this episode for free so you can enjoy it at your leisure. And if you like it, then I will be reading the whole book over on Patreon. So do be sure to check everything out in the description box, or you can head to www.patreon.com/Macabre London. Now, in order to give me enough time to be able to actually get through this book and to read it properly for you and to take the time to be able to produce these episodes in a way that I would like to, then I'll be trying to release one of these about once a month or so. But because I know there's plenty of you out there that will not want to wait for the next part of this story, I'm going to put part 1 up first on the general feed, and then part 2 will also be available for you on Patreon whenever you would like to get there. Now, I think you might find a lot of your creators that you like and support out there are kind of facing similar times at the moment. Unfortunately, advertising money is going down, so the adverts that you hear within shows like mine and other independent podcasters, we're not making as much money as we once used to. And that means platforms like Patreon are really essential to be able to making this into our jobs and to be able to keep us going. So as some of you may know, I don't want to keep this on a down note, so I definitely won't keep going too long on this, but just so you know, one of my goals in 2025 is to make this my full-time job. Now, if you've been with the show for a long time, you'll know that I've been making Macabre London since 2017, so a very long time now, and I love this show. It is my favourite, but in order to be able to make this continue and to keep going with it, with the amount of effort and input and creativity that it requires, and also the costs that are associated with producing a podcast like this, I do have to look towards those platforms. So if you love this show and you have been with me for a long time, I would love for you to get some of this extra content, and that's why I thought reading some of my favourite books might be a really nice way to give that back to you. And obviously I know if this isn't something that you're well versed in, obviously I spend all my time in the podcast realm pretty much. I am very well aware that this is the state of things now for independent podcasters, and the way advertisers are choosing to look after us now has changed. So yes, so things like this where you're actually able to support the content really does make an absolutely huge difference, and it means that I can continue to do this. So this isn't a beg at all, it's just showing you the content that's out there if you want to enjoy it, and also explaining to you why these kind of platforms are really important. So if your independent creators are asking you to support them on platforms like this, then there really is a good reason behind it. I am a big fan of Patreon. I support a couple of creators over there. I'm safe in the knowledge knowing that I'm supporting what they're making and helping to make that continue. Now, as I said, since the very beginning, I've been asked to create bedtime stories because people find my voice relaxing, which is very, very nice to hear, and I do hugely appreciate that. And I'm really pleased that you want to spend time with me, particularly at night time when you're listening to some spooky stuff in the dark. And who am I to deprive you of that? It's not me. I'm going to give you the content that you want. So I wanted to explain to you a little bit about The War of the Worlds and why this is my favourite book. Now, when I was little, I was born in a little town called Woking, which if you are familiar with the kind of London area, you'll know that it's just outside of London. It didn't end up getting swamped into London like other places like Croydon and Bromley and that kind of thing. But yes, it is very near to London. And I grew up there, well, for only a relatively short time until I was around about 5 or 6 years old. And then we moved down to the south coast. Woking itself is known for having this book written about it. So an alien invasion in a commuter town is something which is just nightmare inducing. It really is. And just the thought of this, going to Horsell Common where this is set when we were children, and we would go there quite a lot, and looking at the sand pits where I won't spoil it for you because we'll get there very soon, but going there when I was little was kind of life-changing for me, and it stuck with me for the rest of my life, so much so that I have a War of the Worlds tattoo from the 1978 Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds album. So that's kind of where my obsession lies with it. I love this book. I find that it is really dark in places and kind of horrifying as well. So it's not for the faint of heart. However, it's not gore every 5 seconds. I would say it's just got a really eerie undertone to it, and something that is perfect to listen to at bedtime. Now, there is something that I also think may help alongside these new bedtime spooky stories, and I know you've all heard me talk about Magic Mind for a while now, but they've just released the perfect accompaniment to their beautiful brain-boosting shots, so you can be energised for the whole day, but also able to sleep at night. If you're anything like me, and when you've been working non-stop and you're super tired and are in need of nothing more than a good night's sleep, that's when your brain will decide to keep you up all night. Remember that cringy thing you said once, the relationships that have gone wrong in your life, or the impending doom of facing a full day of work with no sleep? Well, all of this combined can lead to bad mental health, but how about we reframe that into mental wealth? So January is a time to reflect and think about what may help you for the year ahead. So by thinking about the 5 pillars of sleep, diet, exercise, stress management, and the addition of exogenous compounds, those are things we can add into our lives that just make things a little easier. They're all ways we can build up that mental wealth to make sure we're resilient and strong when we need it most. And here is where Magic Mind can help. Magic Mind is great for helping you where you need it most. It boosts your energy, keeps you focused yet calm so you can achieve your goals, keep your stress to a minimum, and know you're getting all the good things in your system like vitamin B complex, vitamin D and vitamin C, alongside things like cordyceps mushrooms to keep you storing all that goodness for when you need it the most, and contributing to your overall mental fortitude. The nano-encapsulation technology also means that each ingredient is more quickly bioavailable to your brain and body, so you get all that goodness fast. They now have their sleep elixir too, so if you combine the two, you know you're doing everything you can to put those metaphorical brain savings in your bank for a rainy day. I've been using Magic Mind every day for almost 6 months now, and I find it's really allowed me to snap into focus so much earlier in my day, to get stuff done and have stamina to complete a few more extra tasks in my day without feeling wired and jittery like regular coffee does. So if that sounds like something you'd like to try, why not give it a go? There's no better time to start than now. Make 2025 the year you build your mental resilience. You can get 45% off the Magic Mind bundle if you're in the US by using my special link, and please make sure you do so it supports the show directly. And if you're outside the US, there's also a link I'll leave for international purchases as well. Just go to magicmind.com/Macabre LT-Jan. That is magicmind.com/MACABRELTJAN. So, let's begin tonight's story, shall we? You probably won't be surprised to know that as this is my favourite book, I do actually collect different cover copies of it. So I have probably, I think, about 15 different copies of The War of the Worlds, which probably in anybody's book is too many books. But the edition I'm reading from this evening is the Everyman book, and this does also have quite an extensive introduction. I obviously won't be reading that because that is still in copyright. However, The War of the Worlds is out of copyright, so we are at free liberty to read this. But first, take a nice deep breath for me. Make sure you're settled down into bed nice and snuggly, or if you're listening to this just to relax, make sure you've got a nice beverage, put your feet up, just close your eyes and relax into it. And I promise I won't make it too scary. No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinised and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinise the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. At most, terrestrial men fancied there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves and ready to welcome a missionary enterprise. Yet, across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. And early in the 20th century came the Great Disillusionment. The planet Mars, I scarcely need to remind the reader, revolves about the Sun at a mean distance of 140 million miles, and the light and heat it receives from the Sun is barely half of that received by this world. It must be, if the nebula hypothesis has any truth, older than our world, and long before this Earth ceased to be molten, life upon its surface must have begun its course. The fact it is scarcely 1/7 of the volume of the Earth must have accelerated its cooling to the temperature at which life could begin. It has air and water, and all that is necessary for the support of animated existence. Yet so vain is man and so blinded by his vanity that no writer up to the very end of the 19th century expressed any idea that intelligent life might have developed there, far or indeed at all beyond its earthly level. Nor was it generally understood that since Mars is older than our Earth, with scarcely a quarter of the superficial area, and remoter from the Sun, it necessarily follows that it is not only more distant from life's beginning, but nearer its end. The secular cooling that must someday overtake our planet has already gone far indeed with our neighbour. Its physical condition is still largely a mystery, but we know that even in its equatorial region, the midday temperature barely approaches that of our coldest winter. Its air is much more attenuated than ours. Its oceans have shrunk until they cover but a third of its surface, and as its slow seasons change, huge snowcaps gather and melt about either pole and periodically inundate its temperate zones. The last stage of exhaustion, which to us is still incredibly remote, has become a present-day problem for the inhabitants of Mars. The immediate pressure of necessity has brightened their intellects, enlarged their powers, and hardened their hearts. And looking across space with instruments and intelligences such as we have scarcely dreamed of, they see, at its nearest distance of only 35 million of miles sunward of them, a morning star of hope, our own warmer planet, green with vegetation and grey with water. With a cloudy atmosphere, eloquent of fertility, with glimpses through its drifting cloud wisps of broad stretches of populous country and narrow, navy-crowded seas. And we men, the creatures who inhabit this earth, must be to them at least as alien and lowly as are the monkeys and lemurs to us. The intellectual side of man already admits that life is an incessant struggle for existence, and it would seem that this too is the belief of the minds upon Mars. Their world is far gone in its cooling, and this world is still crowded with life, but crowded only with what they regard as inferior animals. To carry warfare sunward is indeed their only escape from the destruction that generation after generation creeps upon them. And before we judge of them too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its own inferior races. The Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants in the space of 50 years. Are we such apostles of mercy as to complain if the Martians warred in the same spirit? The Martians seem to have calculated their descent with amazing subtlety. Their mathematical learning is evidently far in excess of ours, and to have carried out their preparations with a well-nigh perfect anonymity. Had our instruments permitted it, we might have seen the gathering trouble far back in the 19th century. Men like Schiaparelli watched the red planet. It is odd, by the by, that for countless centuries Mars has been the star of war, but failed to interpret the fluctuating appearances of the markings they mapped so well. All that time, the Martians must have been getting ready. During the opposition of 1894, a great light was seen on the illuminated part of the disk. First at the Lick Observatory, then by Perrotin of Nice, and then by other observers. English readers heard of it first in the issue of Nature, dated August 2nd. I am inclined to think that this blaze may have been the casting of the huge gun in the vast pit sunk into their planet, from which their shots were fired at us. Peculiar markings, as yet unexplained, were seen near the site of that outbreak during the next two oppositions. The storm burst upon us 6 years ago now. As Mars approached opposition, Ravelle of Java set the wires of the astronomical exchange palpating with the amazing intelligence of a huge outbreak of incandescent gas upon the planet. It had occurred towards midnight of the 12th, and the spectroscope to which he had at once resorted indicated a mass of flaming gas, chiefly hydrogen, moving with an enormous velocity towards this Earth. This jet of fire had become invisible about 12:15. He compared it to a colossal puff of flame, suddenly and violently squirted out of the planet, as flaming gases rushed out of a gun. A singularly appropriate phrase it proved, yet the next day there was nothing of this in the papers except a little note in the Daily Telegraph, and the world went in ignorance of one of the gravest dangers that ever threatened the human race. I might not have heard of the eruption at all had I not met Ogilvy, the well-known astronomer at Ottershaw. He was immensely excited at the news, and in the excess of his feelings invited me up to take a turn with him that night in a scrutiny of the red planet. In spite of all that has happened since, I still remember that vigil very distinctly. The black and silent observatory, the shadowed lantern throwing a feeble glow upon the floor in the corner, the steady ticking of the clockwork of the telescope, the little slit in the roof, an oblong profundity with the stardust streaked across it. Ogilvy moved about, invisible but audible, looking through the telescope. One saw a circle of deep blue, and the little round planet swimming in the field. It seemed such a little thing, so bright and small and still, faintly marked with the transverse stripes and slightly flattened from the perfect round. But so little it was, so silvery warm, a pin's head of light. It was as if it quivered, but really this was the telescope vibrating with the activity of the clockwork that kept the planet in view. As I watched, the planet seemed to grow larger and smaller and to advance and recede, but that was simply that my eye was tired. 40 millions of miles it was from us. More than 40 millions of miles of void. Few people realise the immensity of vacancy in which the dust of the material universe swims. Near it in the field, I remember, were 3 faint points of light. 3 telescopic stars infinitely remote. And all around it was the unfathomable darkness of empty space. You know how that blackness looks on a frosty starlight night? In a telescope it seems far profounder. And invisible to me because it was so remote and small, flying swiftly and steadily towards me across that incredible distance, drawing nearer every minute by so many thousands of miles, came the thing they were sending us, the thing that was to bring so much struggle and calamity and death to Earth. I never dreamed of it then as I watched. No one on Earth dreamed of that unerring missile. That night too, there was another jetting out of gas from the distant planet. I saw it, a reddish flash at the edge, the slightest projection of the outline, just as the chronometer struck midnight. And at that I told Ogilvy, and he took my place. The night was warm, and I was thirsty, and I went, stretching my legs clumsily and feeling my way in the darkness, to the little table where the siphon stood, while Ogilvy exclaimed at the streamer of gas that came out towards us. That night, another invisible missile started on its way to the Earth from Mars, just a second or so under 24 hours after the first one. I remember how I sat on the table there in the blackness, with patches of green and crimson swimming before my eyes. I wished I had a light to smoke by, little suspecting the meaning of the minute gleam I had seen and all that it would presently bring me. Ogilvy watched till 1 and then gave it up, and we lit the lantern and walked over to his house. Down below in the darkness were Ottershaw and Chertsey and all their hundreds of people sleeping in peace. He was full of speculation that night about the condition of Mars, and scoffed at the vulgar idea of its having inhabitants who were signalling us. His idea was that meteorites might be falling in a heavy shower upon the planet, or that a huge volcanic explosion was in progress. He pointed out to me how unlikely it was that organic evolution had taken the same direction in the 2 adjacent planets. The chances against anything man-like on Mars are 1,000,000 to 1, he said. Hundreds of observers saw the flame that night, and the night after, about midnight, and again the night after, and so for 10 nights, a flame each night. Why the shot ceased after the 10th, no one on Earth has attempted to explain. It may be the gases of the firing caused the Martians inconvenience. Dense clouds of smoke or dust, visible through a powerful telescope on Earth as little grey fluctuating patches, spread through the clearness of the planet's atmosphere and obscured its more familiar features. Even the daily papers woke up to the disturbances at last, and popular notes appeared here, there, and everywhere concerning the volcanoes upon Mars. The serio-comic periodical Punch, I remember, made a happy use of it in the political cartoon. And all unsuspected, those missiles the Martians had fired at us drew earthward, rushing now at a pace of many miles a second through the empty gulf of space, hour by hour and day by day, nearer and nearer. It seems to me now almost incredibly wonderful that with swift fate hanging over us, men could go about their petty concerns as they did. I remember how jubilant Markham was at securing a new photograph of the planet for the illustrated paper he edited in those days. People in these latter times scarcely realise the abundance and enterprise of our 19th century papers. For my own part, I was much occupied in learning to ride the bicycle, and busy upon a series of papers discussing the probable developments of moral ideas as civilization progressed. One night, the first missile then could scarcely have been 10 million miles away, I went for a walk with my wife. It was starlight, and I explained the signs of the zodiac to her, and pointed out Mars, a bright dot of light creeping zenithward, towards which so many telescopes were pointed. It was a warm night. Coming home, a party of excursionists from Chertsey or Isleworth passed us singing and playing music. There were lights in the upper windows of the houses as the people went to bed. From the railway station in the distance came the sound of shunting trains, ringing and rumbling, softened almost into melody by the distance. My wife pointed out to me the brightness of the red, green and yellow signal lights hanging in a framework against the sky. It seemed so safe and tranquil. Chapter 2. The Falling Star. Then came the night of the first falling star. It was seen early in the morning, rushing over Winchester eastward, a line of flame high in the atmosphere. Hundreds must have seen it and taken it for an ordinary falling star. Albin described it as leaving a greenish streak behind it that glowed for some seconds. Denning, our greatest authority on meteorites, stated that the height of its first appearance was about 90 or 100 miles. It seemed to him that it fell to Earth about 100 miles east of him. I was at home at that hour and writing in my study, and although my French windows faced towards Ottershaw and the blind was up, for I loved in those days to look up at the night sky, I saw nothing of it. Yet this strangest of all things that ever came to Earth from outer space must have fallen while I was sitting there, visible to me had I only looked up as it passed. Some of those who saw its flight say it travelled with a hissing sound. I myself heard nothing of that. Many people in Berkshire, Surrey and Middlesex must have seen the fall of it, and at most have thought that another meteorite had descended. No one seems to have troubled to look for the fallen mass that night. But very early in the morning, poor Ogilvy, who had seen the shooting star and who was persuaded that a meteorite lay somewhere on the common between Horsell, Ottershaw and Woking, rose early with the idea of finding it. Find it he did, soon after dawn, and not far from the sandpits. An enormous hole had been made by the impact of the projectile, and the sand and gravel had been flung violently in every direction over the heath, forming heaps visible a mile and a half away. The heather was on fire eastward, and a thin blue smoke rose against the dawn. The thing itself lay almost entirely buried in sand, amidst the scattered splinters of a fir tree it had shivered to fragments in its descent. The uncovered part had the appearance of a huge cylinder, caked over, and its outline softened by a thick, scaly, dun-coloured incrustation. It had a diameter of about 30 yards. He approached the mass, surprised at the size and more so at the shape, since most meteorites are rounded more or less completely. It was, however, still so hot from its flight through the air as to forbid his near approach. A stirring noise within its cylinder he ascribed to the unequal cooling of its surface, for at that time it had not occurred to him that it might be hollow. He remained standing at the edge of the pit that the thing had made for itself, staring at its strange appearance, astonished chiefly at its unusual shape and colour, and dimly perceiving even then some evidence of its design in its arrival. The early morning was wonderfully still, and the sun, just clearing the pine trees towards Weybridge, was already warm. He did not remember hearing any birds that morning. There was certainly no breeze stirring, and the only sounds were the faint movements from within the cindery cylinder. He was all alone on the common. Then suddenly he noticed with a start that some of the grey clinker, the ashy incrustation that covered the meteorite, was falling off at the circular edge of the end. It was dripping off in flakes and raining down upon the sand. A large piece suddenly came off and fell with a sharp noise that brought his heart into his mouth. For a minute he scarcely realised what this meant, and although the heat was excessive, he clambered down into the pit close to the bulk to see the thing more clearly. He fancied even then that the cooling of the body might account for this, but what disturbed that idea was the fact that the ash was falling only from the end of the cylinder. And then he perceived that, very slowly, The circular top of the cylinder was rotating on its body. It was such a gradual movement that he discovered it only through noticing that a black mark that had been near him 5 minutes ago was now at the other side of the circumference. Even then, he scarcely understood what this indicated, until he heard a muffled grating sound and saw the black mark jerk forward an inch or so. Then the thing came upon him in a flash. The cylinder was artificial, hollow, with an end that screwed out. Something within the cylinder was unscrewing the top. "Good heavens," said Ogilvy, "there's a man in it, men in it, half roasted to death, trying to escape." At once, with a quick mental leap, he linked the thing with the flash upon Mars. The thought of the confined creature was so dreadful to him that he forgot the heat and went forward to the cylinder to help turn, but luckily the dull radiation arrested him before he could burn his hands on the still glowing metal. At that he stood irresolute for a moment, then turned, scrambled out of the pit, and set off running wildly into Woking. The time then must have been somewhere about 6 o'clock. He met a waggoner and tried to make him understand, but the tale he told and his appearance were so wild, his hat had fallen off in the pit, that the man simply drove on. He was equally unsuccessful with the potman, who was just unlocking the doors of the public house by Horsell Bridge. The fellow thought he was a lunatic at large and made an unsuccessful attempt to shut him into the tap room. That sobered him a little. And when he saw Henderson, the London journalist, in his garden, he called over the palings and made himself understood. "Henderson," he called, "you saw that shooting star last night?" "Well," said Henderson, "it's out on Horsell Common now." "Good Lord," said Henderson, "fallen meteorite, that's good." "But it's something more than a meteorite. It's a cylinder, an artificial cylinder, man, and there's something inside." Henderson stood up with his spade in his hand. "What's that?" he said. He was deaf in one ear. Ogilvy told him all that he had seen. Henderson was a minute or so taking it in. Then he dropped his spade, snatched up his jacket, and came out into the road. The two men hurried back at once to the common and found the cylinder still lying in the same position. But now the sounds inside had ceased, and a thin cycle of bright metal showed between the top and the body of the cylinder. Air was either entering or escaping at the rim with a thin, sizzling sound. They listened, rapped on the scaly burnt metal with a stick, and meeting with no response, they both concluded the man or the men inside must be insensible or dead. Of course, the two were quite unable to do anything. They shouted consolation and promises and went off back to the town again to get help. One can imagine them, covered with sand, excited and disordered, running up the little street in the bright sunlight just as the shop folks were taking down their shutters and people were opening their bedroom windows. Henderson went into the railway station at once in order to telegraph the news to London. The newspapers had prepared men's minds for the reception of the idea. By 8 o'clock, a number of boys and unemployed men had already started for the common to see the dead men from Mars. That was the form the story took. I heard of it first from my newspaper boy about 8:45, when I went out to get my daily chronicle. I was naturally startled and lost no time in going out and across the Ottershaw Bridge to the sandpits. Chapter 3 on Horsell Common. I found a little crowd of perhaps 20 people surrounding the huge hole in which the cylinder lay. I have already described the appearance of that colossal bulk embedded in the ground. The turf and gravel about it seemed charred as if by a sudden explosion. No doubt its impact had caused a flash of fire. Henderson and Ogilvy were not there. I think they perceived that nothing was to be done for the present and had gone away to breakfast at Henderson's house. There were 4 or 5 boys sitting on the edge of the pit, with their feet dangling, and amusing themselves, until I stopped them by throwing stones at the giant mass. After I had spoken to them about it, they began playing at touch in and out of a group of bystanders. Among these were a group of cyclists, a jobbing gardener I employed sometimes, a girl carrying a baby, Greg the butcher and his little boy, and 2 or 3 loafers and golf caddies who were accustomed to hang about the railway station. There was very little talking. Few of the common people in England had anything but the vaguest astronomical ideas in those days. Most of them were staring quietly at the big table-like end of the cylinder, which was still as Ogilvy and Henderson had left it. I fancy the popular expectation of a heap of charred corpses was disappointed at this inanimate bulk. Some went away while I was there, and other people came. I clambered into the pit and fancied I heard a faint movement under my feet. The top had certainly ceased to rotate. It was only when I got thus close to it that the strangeness of this object was at all evident to me. At the first glance, it was really no more exciting than an overturned carriage or a tree blown across the road. Not so much so, indeed. It looked like a rusty gas float. It required a certain amount of scientific education to perceive that the grey scale of the thing was common oxide, that the yellowish-white metal that gleamed in the crack between the lid and the cylinder had an unfamiliar hue. Extraterrestrial had no meaning for most of the onlookers. At that time, it was quite clear in my own mind that the thing had come from the planet Mars, but I judged it improbable that it contained any living creature. I thought the unscrewing might be automatic. In spite of Ogilvy, I still believed that there were men in Mars. My mind ran fancifully on the possibilities of its containing manuscripts, on the difficulties in translation that might arise, whether we should find coins and models in it, and so forth. Yet it was a little too large for assurance on this idea. I felt an impatience to see it opened. About 11, as nothing seemed happening, I walked back, full of thoughts, to my home in Maybury, but I found it difficult to get to work upon my abstract investigations. In the afternoon, the appearance of the common had altered very much. The early editions of the evening papers had startled London with enormous headlines. A message received from Mars, remarkable story from Woking, and so forth. In addition, Ogilvy's wire to the Astronomical Exchange had roused every observatory in the 3 kingdoms. There were 6 flies or more from the Woking station standing in the road by the sandpits, a basket chaise from Cobham, and a rather lordly carriage. Besides that, there was quite a heap of bicycles. In addition, a large number of people must have walked in spite of the heat of the day from Woking and Chertsey, so that there was altogether quite a considerable crowd, 1 or 2 gaily dressed ladies among the others. It was glaringly hot, not a cloud in the sky, nor a breath of wind, and the only shadow was that of the few scattered pine trees. The burning heather had been extinguished, but the level ground towards Ottershaw was blackened as far as one could see, and still giving off vertical streamers of smoke. An enterprising sweetstuff dealer in the Cobham Road had sent up his son with a barrow-load of green apples and ginger beer. Going to the edge of the pit, I found it occupied by a group of almost 6 men, Henderson, Ogilvy, and a tall, fair-haired man that I afterwards learned was Stent, the Astronomer Royal. With several workmen wielding spades and pickaxes, Stent was giving directions in a clear, high-pitched voice. He was standing on the cylinder, which was now evidently much cooler. His face was crimson and streaming with perspiration, and something seemed to have irritated him. A large portion of the cylinder had been uncovered, though its lower end was still embedded. As soon as Ogilvy saw me among the staring crowd on the edge of the pit, he called me to come down, and asked me if I would mind going over to see Lord Hilton, the lord of the manor. The growing crowd, he said, was becoming a serious impediment to their excavations, especially the boys. They wanted a light railing put up, and help to keep the people back. He told me that a faint stirring was occasionally still audible within the case, but that the workmen had failed to unscrew the top, as it afforded no grip to them. The case appeared to be enormously thick, and it was possible that the faint sounds we heard represented a noisy tumult in the interior. I was very glad to do as he asked, and so became one of the privileged spectators within the contemplated enclosure. I failed to find Lord Hilton at his house, but I was told he was expected from London by the 6 o'clock train from Waterloo. And as it was then about 5:15, I went home, had some tea, and walked up to the station to waylay him. Chapter 4. The cylinder opens. When I returned to the common, the sun was setting. Scattered groups were hurrying from the direction of Woking, and 1 or 2 persons were returning. The crowd about the pit had increased and stood out black against the lemon yellow of the sky. A couple of 100 people, perhaps. There were raised voices, and some sort of struggle appeared to be going on about the pit. Strange imaginings passed through my mind. As I drew nearer, I heard Stent's voice. "Keep back, keep back." A boy came running towards me. "It's a movin'," he said to me as he passed. "A screwin' and a screwin' out. I don't like it. I'm going home." I went on to the crowd. They were really, I should think, 200 or 300 people, elbowing and jostling one another. The 1 or 2 ladies there being by no means the least active. "He's fallen in the pit," cried someone. "Keep back," said several. The crowd swayed a little, and I elbowed my way through. Everyone seemed greatly excited. I heard a peculiar humming sound from the pit. "I say," said Ogilvy, "keep these idiots back. We don't know what's in the confounded thing, you know." I saw a young man, a shop assistant in Woking. I believe he was standing on the cylinder and trying to scramble out of the hole again. The crowd had pushed him in. The end of the cylinder was being screwed out from within. Nearly 2 feet of shining screw projected. Somebody blundered against me, and I narrowly missed being pitched onto the top of the screw. So the screw must have come out, for the lid of the cylinder fell upon the gravel with a ringing concussion. I stuck my elbow into the person behind me and turned my head towards the thing again. For a moment, that circular cavity seemed perfectly black. I had the sunset in my eyes. I think everybody expected to see a man emerge, possibly something a little unlike us terrestrial men. But in all essentials, a man. I know I did, but looking, I presently saw something stirring within the shadow, greyish, billowy movements, one above another, and then 2 luminous discs like eyes. Then something resembling a little grey snake, about the thickness of a walking stick, coiled up out of the writhing middle, and wriggled in the air towards me, and then another. A sudden chill came over me. There was a loud shriek from a woman behind. I half turned, keeping my eyes fixed upon the cylinder still, from which other tentacles were now projecting, and began pushing my way back from the edge of the pit. I saw astonishment giving place to horror on the faces of the people about me. I heard inarticulate exclamations on all sides. There was a general movement backwards. I saw the shopman struggling still on the edge of the pit. I found myself alone and saw the people on the other side of the pit running off, Stent among them. I looked again at the cylinder, and ungovernable terror gripped me. I stood, petrified and staring. A big greyish rounded bulk, the size perhaps of a bear, was rising slowly and painfully out of the cylinder. As it bulged up and caught the light, it glistened like wet leather. 2 large dark-coloured eyes were regarding me steadfastly. The mass that framed them, the head of the thing, was rounded, and had, one might say, a face. There was a mouth under the eyes, the lipless brim of which quivered and panted and dropped saliva. The whole creature heaved and pulsated convulsively. A lank tentacular appendage gripped the edge of the cylinder. Another swayed in the air. Those who have never seen a living Martian can scarcely imagine the strange horror of its appearance, the peculiar V-shaped mouth with its pointed upper lip, the absence of brow ridges, the absence of a chin beneath the wedge-like lower lip, the incessant quivering of the mouth, the gorgon groups of tentacles, the tumultuous breathing of the lungs in a strange atmosphere, the evident heaviness and painfulness of movement due to the greater gravitational energy of the earth. Above all, the extraordinary intensity of the immense eyes were at once vital, intense, inhuman, crippled, and monstrous. There was something fungoid in the oily brown skin, something in the clumsy deliberation of the tedious movements unspeakably nasty. Even at this first encounter, this first glimpse, I was overcome with disgust and dread. Suddenly, the monster vanished. It had toppled over the brim of the cylinder and fallen into the pit with a thud like the fall of a great mass of leather. I heard it give a peculiar thick cry, and forthwith another of these creatures appeared darkly in the deep shadow of the aperture. I turned and, running madly, made for the first group of trees, perhaps 100 yards away, but I ran slantingly and stumbling, for I could not avert my face from these things. There, among some young pine trees and furze bushes, I stopped, panting, and waited further developments. The common round the sand pits was dotted with people, standing like myself in a half-fascinated terror, staring at these creatures, or rather at the heaped gravel at the edge of the pit in which they lay. And then, with a renewed horror, I saw a round black object bobbing up and down on the edge of the pit. It was the head of the shopman who had fallen in, but showing as a little black object against the hot western sky. Now he got his shoulder and knee up, and again he seemed to slip back until only his head was visible. Suddenly he vanished, and I could have fancied a faint shriek had reached me. I had a momentary impulse to go back and help him, but my fears overruled. Everything was then quite invisible, hidden by the deep pit and the heap of sand that the fall of the cylinder had made. Anyone coming along the road from Cobham or Woking would have been amazed at the sight. A dwindling multitude, or perhaps 100 people or more, standing in a great irregular circle in ditches, behind bushes, behind gates and hedges, saying little to one another, and that, in short, excited shouts, and staring hard at a few heaps of sand. The barrow of ginger beer stood a queer derelict, black against the burning sky. And in the sandpits was a row of deserted vehicles with their horses feeding out of nosebags or pawing at the ground. Thank you for joining me for those first few episodes. I will not speak too loudly just in case you have fallen asleep, but just to remind you, the next part of this will be up on Patreon right now for you to go and enjoy if you enjoyed that and you want to dive straight into the next episode. It will be on the tier which is as low as £3 a month. So one of these will be out next time within another month or so, and if you enjoyed it, I'd love to see you on the Patreon. So thank you very much for listening. Have very sweet dreams. Try not to have too many nightmares. And I'll see you for part 2 next time.